Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Lesher Tzvi Wolf for the Sufganiyot in honor of Chaim Levi's daughter's engagement and upcoming marriage. Mazel Tov, Chaim. Okay, so today's topic is: can we daven in English or in any other language other than Hebrew? But for most of us, that would be English. And I got a number of sources for this shir. I saw Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz has a whole outline, Rabbi Yoshua Pfeffer, and also Rabbi Kaufman from Cincinnati gave a shir on this a number of years ago. So there's a Gemara in Shabbos in the source sheet, source number 1. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that the Rabbanim used to follow Rabbi Elazar when he went to visit sick people. And when he would go and check in on the sick, and Zimnin Omar Hamakom Yifkadecha Lishalom. Sometimes he would say in Hebrew, sometimes he would say, May Hashem remember you for peace. And Zimnin Omar Le Rachmana Yidkarinach Lishlam. And sometimes in Aramaic he would say that Hashem again should remember you and should heal you. So the Gemara asks, how could he do this? Hechi Avid Hachi. V'ha'amar Rav Yehuda la'olam al yishal adam b'lashon al yishal adam tzaracha b'lashon arami. You're not allowed to daven, to pray for one's needs in Aramaic. Why? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan kol hashoal tzaracha b'lashon arami ein malachi ashares niskakin lo. If you pray in Aramaic, the angels do not deal with that. Literally, niskakin means they don't deal with it. We'll see what that means soon. What does that mean? They don't recognize it. And apparently, the way that the system works, God set up a system in which the malachim take your tefillos, however this works, and bring it up. And therefore, the Gemara says you shouldn't pray in Aramaic. So the Gemara answers, Shani choler teshchina imo. Going to visit a sick person is different because when you're with a sick person, the Shechina is in the room, and you don't need the Malachim to go and bring your tefillos up to Shemayim. Again, I don't know what this means, but there's a more palpable, tangible, God is more accessible in some way. And therefore, if you're doing Bikur Cholim, you can daven in English, which is a way many of the poskim point this out, that any issue with speaking any other language is not an issue when it comes to visiting a sick person or davening for them. And just as a side tangent a little bit, people should know that if you're doing Bikur Cholim, we have someone who's becoming Mirz Hashem, one of the Hatzalah responders. So if it's not really Bikur Cholim, there it's Mamish Refuah. But in general, if you're helping out with someone who's a Choleh, so it's important to tend to their physical needs, but also, if there's nothing you can do on the physical level, one should daven. One should daven for the person who's sick. So we see from this Gemara, you could daven in any language. You could just say, I'm going to pray for you. I hope that you get better. God, please answer the prayers and assist with his healing.
Is that, sorry?
Yeah.
Is that refer to your...
Good morning, Mayor.
Does that refer to your personal tefillah or community?
Yeah, it could be a personal tefillah.
But the text that the Chacham...
Very good. Yeah, good question. Good point.
The text that the Chacham established as tefillah, as we know it today, that you can say it in any language, or your personal tefillah?
It appears that this is any language, because I'm not familiar with this particular tefillah in Aramaic that Rabbi Elazar used. It seems to be it was his own, but yeah, we'll see there may be differences in the shitos, in the poskim when it comes to set texts versus your own authored, spontaneous tefillah. It's a good point. As usual, Chaim's ahead of the game, getting into the sugyas, but it's a very good point. There is a difference, but it seems to be, I would say tentatively, this example in terms of davening by a sick person, it could be your own, as I would say in football, your own audible.
There's also another example when you do Erev Tafshilah, they tell you if you don't understand it.
Yes.
The Hebrew words, you have to use it in English.
Right. It's a good point.
That's not a tefillah, it's a declaration.
Maybe it's a declaration. Yeah. Okay. The issue with this is so just it seems to be from the Gemara, you can't use Aramaic, but it seemingly maybe other languages, maybe yes, or maybe no. What's the reason that we said that Aramaic's not good? So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, source number 2, Emes Liyaakov, he says, some people would say, the angels don't understand Aramaic. He says, no, that's not what it is. Angels can understand. This is a point that some of the other posts can make. Angels could understand your thoughts. So before it even is formulated as a language, they know what you're thinking. So what does it mean they don't know what it means? So Rav Yaakov suggests it's not that they don't know what it means. Maybe it's a little bit of a knetch in the lashon of makirin. They don't recognize it. They don't get involved. They don't deem it fit to get involved in a language like Aramaic. Why? So it says in Emes Yaakov, they quote from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, She'ha'aramis mikorohu miloshen hakodesh. Its source is Lashon HaKodesh. That's why you'll see a lot of similarities. Sefer Daniel is written in Aramaic. You'll see a lot of Aramaic there. It's similar to Lashon HaKodesh. Ela Shehu, now we need Gabi's expertise here. Looks like Yiddish. Verganst.
Over here?
Yeah.
The footnote in source number 2, 16, footnote 16. Vergranzt. I think it means mistaken. It has mistakes in it. They don't want to get involved in a language which has mistakes in it. I don't know if, Gabi, you know what that word is in Yiddish? Vergreinst? Vergessen is forgotten. What is vergreinst? I don't know. Google Translate doesn't know either. I looked last night.
It's strange because originally Yiddish came from German.
Yeah. I don't know. Okay, if Gabi doesn't know, then I feel I'm okay. I don't know. So, but Rav Yaakov's saying is that it's a language that has certain issues with it, which is also very interesting because we have Targum Onkelos, which is Aramaic. Apparently, comes from Sinai. So that I'm not really sure, but it's interesting that his pshat is that not that they don't understand it, they don't want to get involved in it, they don't recognize it because it has issues with it. So it seems like that other languages may be problematic. However, if you look at the Gemara in Sota, Daf Lamed Beis, the Gemara in Sota lists a number of things that could be done in Kol Lashon, in any language, and it lists Parsha Sota, Vidoy Meiser, that's why it's mentioned in Masechah Sota, Kriya Shema Utfila. Kriya Shema Utfila. Any language you can do Kriya Shema Utfila. So that seems to be a point-blank contradiction. So in fact, later on in the Gemara in Sota, it does distinguish between a yachid, an individual, and a tzibor, and the congregation, which is in fact how some of the Rishonim reconcile these two Gemaras. Excuse me. Excuse me. There's basically 3 approaches in the Rishonim how to reconcile these two Gemaras. Right? The Gemara in Shabbos seems to say Aramaic. Guys, you don't all have to look into Google Translate. It's okay. We're moving on. It's fine. So the Gemara in Shabbos says you can't learn it. You can't say really daven in English, or the Gemara says not Aramaic or seemingly other languages. The Gemara in Sota says you can for Kriya Shema or Tefillah. So there's 3 approaches. Seemingly any language, Kol Lashon, any language. So there's 3 ways to reconcile these two Gemaras. The first way is the Rif, which, as I just alluded to, the Rif uses a certain line in the Gemara in Sota, and he says, this is quoted in the Beis Yosef, source number 4, Orachaim Kuf Aleph Sif Katan Yud, the Beis Yosef, Kosev Arif, he says, Hayakore, in Perika, this is the beginning, and I think it's in Brachos. And the Rif says, it says, Tefillah b'chol lashon hani mili, that is referring to B'tzibor. Alva b'yachid lo. The Rif says, in Maseches Brachos, that when you're an individual, you can't use other languages, but if you're davening as a congregation, you can. Second way to reconcile the Gemaras is the Rabbeinu Yonah. The Rabbeinu Yonah, he says, quoting, this is the Beis Yosef quoting Rabbeinu Yonah, he says, Kevan da asikna de tefillah b'yachid ina ne'emeres el b'lashon kodesh. Since we just said you have to read the daven in lashon kodesh, tema al haminik shenagu b'chol ha'olam. this is a very problematic, the practice of all of the world. Shenhanashim mispalalos b'shar lishonos. Women, you have to remember, in those days, women they weren't necessarily literate. They didn't have the whole Beis Yaakov movement. They didn't have formalized Jewish education, and they didn't really know how to even read.
In Morocco, the women stay home. In Morocco,
not only did they stay home, they didn't even know how to read. I remember, this is not about women, but I remember I had a friend of mine in yeshiva. I think maybe it was, I don't remember which kind of Sephardi. I'm thinking Bukhari, but maybe not. Bukharian's not even the same. That's a different type. But I was in the Rosh Yeshiva's office, I think for good reason. And my friend had his friend visiting, and my friend was, I think, Sephardi, so I have to get, I don't remember. And his father came to visit, and my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Greenwald, and from TJ, he had like a sense, he like knew the dynamics in the Sephardi world. So he asked my friend's father, when you were growing up, did you ever make eye contact with your father? He said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You look down. You look down. You don't look at your father in the face. That's like that's the culture. I don't know about Morocco, but that was the culture in his family.
in Morocco, the women don't look at the men.
And then for sure, they probably don't look. Yeah. So it's a different culture, totally. But Rabbi Yonah is asking, so what did they do? Of course they davened. They didn't not daven. They davened in any language that they knew. But he's questioning it. How did they do such a thing? So he suggests, in the name of Rabbeinu Tzarfat, the French rabbis, Rotzim laseis tam l'minog. They tried to give a reasoning for this practice. V'omrim, they said, Kishiyachid mispal betfil ba'atzma shemispal nosot tzibor. If they're saying, this is what Chaim said, if they're davening a tefillah, which is a set tefillah, a text, and they're using a translation, or they're sort of authoring a translation, maybe, Kimo tefillah satzibor dainin leh. We consider it to be a tefillah, like a formal tefillah. V'yachla omra yachid b'loshen acheres. In other words, this is Rabbi Yonah is saying, when it's your own, spontaneous tefillah, then no, you can't use other languages. But if you're using a set text and you're translating that text, then you can use other languages. Because for sure, he agrees with the Rif, seems to be, that davening with a group, that you can do with any language, because that was what the Gemara in Sota said, Yachid not, Sibor yes. However, he extends it even to a Yachid, to an individual, but an individual is using a set text. Then we have the final way to reconcile these two Gemaras is the Rosh. The Rosh says, also quoted in source number 4 in the Beis Yosef, he says, what's the problem with Aramaic? This is a whole different explanation. He says, Loshen zeh miguna be'ineihem. The language of Aramaic, it fits a little bit with Rav Yaakov's point, it's despicable to them. They don't like that language. And therefore, when we said you shouldn't daven in Loshen Aramis, it's because that specific language is a problem. However, other languages you can use. So therefore, the Rosh would be the most, the most lenient in the sense that you can use any language, just not Aramaic, and it would fit with Rav Yaakov saying that why is it in Lashon Meguna? Why is it despicable or disgusting, whatever? Because it's mistaken, it has mistakes in it.
In Yiddish, according to this Muslim app, it means grown up.
Grown up.
Whatever that, however it fits.
Interesting. I don't know. Interesting. Okay. Parenthetically, the Mishnah Berurah points out that this is only talking about languages that you understand or that is spoken about. If you understand, let's say, English and you're davening in English, fine. But if you're davening in French and you don't understand it, so that doesn't really even help you. So that would be something to think about and to note in terms of even within the Rosh's opinion. You have to know what the language is that you're using. You have to understand it. The Mishnah Berurah also points something out that... I mentioned before that the Malachim understand what you're thinking about. That's actually in the Rosh. The Rosh says, quoted in the Beis Yosef, he says, Shar l'shonos ina megunim be'ineihem. Sorry, here. He says, "Hello, afilu machshavos levadim yodim u'makirin." All angels know what you're thinking, so obviously they have to be able to understand the language, and they choose not to. So that was from the Rush. Okay, the Mishabura also he points out. You could take a look in source number 5. He quotes from that Rush, and he says. Someone mentioned Erev Tafshilin, which may be or may not be a tefillah, but there are many tefillos that we do use Aramaic for. Yikum Perkan, Baruch Shmei, parts of Uvalat Tzion. So how could we say that you shouldn't use it? So his understanding is because the issue would be doing it b'tzibor. The issue would be b'yachid. But when you daven with it tzibor. Have to go? No. When you're davening in the tzibor, you can do these other tefillos, and that's why, in fact, you'll see in the siddur, it will say if you're not with the tzibor, you don't say yukum perkan. I know some people are very makbid not to be in shul yukum perkan. There's it's not with tzibor.
I thought it's the second one you don't say. I thought it's first one you say, the second one.
Anything in Aramaic. Anything in Aramaic.
You should say with the tzibur or should not say?
Should only say if you're with the congregation. If you miss it, sometimes if you miss some tefillas, you can make up. But this tefillah you don't make up because you have to say it with the tzibur. It's possible there is a logic to this because tefillah b'tzibur is on a very high level. It doesn't need the malachim to go. What this means kabbalistically, or I don't know what this means exactly. But the malachim are sort of a medium in some way. They don't need it when you're with a tzibur, because a tzibur has a power that your tefillas go straight to Hashem. When you're an individual, then you need the malachim, and the malachim don't involve themselves with Aramaic, so therefore you don't say Yukum Perkan or Baruch Shmei. By the way, Baruch Shmei is a passage from the Zohar, which is so. I don't know if you could learn a passage in the Zohar on your own. Why can't you daven it? I don't know.
So those tefillos were written at that time when the language that was spoken was Aramaic.
Maybe.
So
yeah.
Like
to me, it's a non-starter.
Baruch Shmei specifically put in Aramaic. It was never
right.
All the other
It's a passage from the Zohar, which is written a lot in Aramaic. Danny's point is well taken. And unless you say Aramaic has a higher level, you can do Shnai Mikra Targum in Aramaic. But maybe Danny's point is, according to what we said in the Mishabura, if you don't know what you're saying, it's an interesting point. I didn't see this in the poskim. Doesn't mean it's not true, but or it's not there. It could be it's there. If it's a spoken language and it's no longer spoken, so it's not only that I'm in the wrong locale, it's literally not understood by anybody. So maybe that's an issue also.
So, on a practical level,
yeah.
If you miss Baruch Shmei as an example,
yeah,
and you want to hear Torah reading, I heard you shouldn't really be doing Torah reading unless you've said Baruch Shmei. I don't know if that's.
I don't think so. I mean,
okay, so
whoever if you ask, if someone said that, you could ask them.
But if you
have a chiyuv to hear Kriyas Torah, you missed Baruch Shmei. The Mishabura says you don't say Baruch Shmei without tzibur.
Is it better to say it in English?
I mean, we'll get to davening in English. We'll get to that. But I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying.
Specifically Aramaic, then.
Right. It's a good question. I never thought about that option. I think that the point is, it's a tefillah. So if we're going to see, if some poskim say you're allowed to daven in other languages, then fine. It's the same. Would be probably the same as any. But other poskim say no, you shouldn't. So if it's depending on what your position would be. But the general psak seems to be that you don't say it at all. Which is interesting. Lawrence is asking, why don't you say it in English? We'll see soon. Some poskim are opposed to davening in English in general. So speaking of which, we have a fourth approach, which really comes from the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't ever quote explicitly this idea of davening b'chol lashon, but he does mention it by Kriya Shema. But he does say something interesting in the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah. He explains the historical precedent, the historical, not precedent, but the historical background as to why Anshe Knesset Agadola established Shmona Esrei. So he says that Kevan Shigol, this is the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah. Kevan Shigol, source number 6. Kevan Shigol Yisrael b'yemei Nebuchadnezzar Russia. When the Jews were exiled in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, Nisarvu b'fratz v'yavan, they were interspersed throughout Persia and in Greece, and Shar Ha'umos, they were like exiled. And they had children in faraway lands. I was just talking to someone before that said it's time, we have to make Aliyah. It's really feel the pull towards Eretz Yisrael. And we're being reminded by our neighbors, this is not the place. Someone said the weather and our neighbors are reminding me that this is not the... And those children, so the original generation, they at least were there in the times where we had our sovereignty in Israel. But then their children, they don't even have the language, right? I wish that I had more Yiddish, I can understand a little bit of Yiddish, but my grandparents, they spoke Yiddish, but they didn't, it's like one step removed, right? I'm actually third generation American, which I know it's very rare for Toronto to be, but they spoke Yiddish. I mean, it's crazy to think that my family is very secular, but like they came from Yiddish speaking homes, and they had all this language mixed in with other things. I remember my bubby told me when she grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and there was a rabbi who they brought in, or maybe I don't remember why he was there, but it was like there were like 2 or 3 shuls. One was Reform, one was Sephardic, and one was, I guess, Orthodox. But it was in Montgomery, Alabama, in the early 20th century. So she said she remembers the rabbi would speak. He would try to make a point of speaking in English. He would start speaking in English, and he'd say and then he would go right into Yiddish, or and then he would start speaking in Yiddish. So they didn't, like she said, she and her sister, they were just like laughing about it, like during the sermon, because he was he's thinking, I'm going to speak in English, and then he goes right into Yiddish. So and therefore they couldn't they couldn't speak, they couldn't daven because they didn't have a proper language that was normative for them, and everything was mixed around with different things, and they didn't have the language to daven. Therefore, they felt limited, and they couldn't have one coherent language to express their tefillos. And therefore, the Rambam says, people felt inhibited. They didn't feel free to. You have this experience if you don't have a certain comfortability with the language, so you feel limited, and that's why when Ezra saw this, the Rambam says Kivan Shara Ezra Ubeistino, they saw this was an issue, so therefore Kach Amdu V'Tiknu Lem Shmona Esrei Brachos Al Seder. Therefore they came and they made Shmona Esrei. So it seems to be, I heard this once from Rav Meir Tversky. It seems to be that if you read this, the Rambam, he's saying this would probably be true for us today. We don't have our own way to formulate tefillah because our language is not so pristine and so accurate, and that's why he said. I think he was paskening, but he's not really a posek. But he was saying, therefore, if you want to add in, but a lot of people say, add in your own tefillos and elokai nitzor at the end of Shemona Esrei. And he felt, no, you don't. We don't have the lashon that is pristine, that is seder, that is matbeh of tefillah, and therefore he was against using your own language even after elokai nitzor, because he felt, based on this Rambam, that the Rambam said people don't have the proper way to express themselves because we're living in the Golus, we're living well removed from the original Lashon Kodesh. So that's the Rambam's opinion. It doesn't really make it into the Shulchan Aruch, but for a brisker like Rav Tversky, I imagine that's probably what he does. But it's an interesting thing. The Shulchan Aruch quotes 3 opinions. Basically the 3 opinions that we went through, the Rif, the Rabbeinu Yonah, and the Rush. In Siman Kuf Ayin, Sif Daled, he says, first the Rif, if you're on your own, only Lashon Kodesh. If you're with a tzibor, any language. That's one. Then he says, V'yesh omrim, there are those that say what we said before, Chaim said, set text you can use other languages. Non-set text, spontaneous tefillah, only Lashon Kodesh. And then the third opinion, Yesh Omrim, that the Rosh said the only issue would be Lashon Aramis, Aramaic, because that is a Lashon that is Meguna. So, what does anyone know when the Shulchan Aruch, Dovi knows this probably, when the Shulchan Aruch gives a Stam V'yesh, what's the halacha? Rabbi Klein?
It's like 15 years ago.
It's okay. I'm not picking on you for a chaber. He's a. Okay, there you go. But how many tests? If you do like 17, I heard that you maybe.
We'll be like
Depends if you give money to the OU SCP.
Right.
Then they, if a bunch of
Fast track.
Stam v'yesh halach kistam. If you have the Shulchan Aruch says an opinion, then he says v'yesh omrim. Generally, the rule is the halacha is like the first opinion. So the first opinion in the Shulchan Aruch, you remember that? Yeah, of course. I know. Just jogging the memory. No, stam v'yesh halacha kistam. So the halacha is it seems to be cut and dry. Shulchan Aruch, we alone know, but with the tzibur you could daven in English or in German or whatever. So it's an interesting thing. This is what the Shulchan Aruch says. This is what you'd think is the rule. And then all the Achronim come and they say, no, you shouldn't do this. You can imagine why. Someone want to guess? Why would all the Achronim say, no, you should daven in only Lashon Kodesh? Think from a political, historical...
It gets Jews in shul. If you're worried about
gets Jews in shul to daven Lashon Kodesh.
To daven whatever language.
No, so the Achronim all say no. The Achronim all are very hesitant, even though the Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim seem to be saying up until the modern day that you could daven in any language.
The development of the Reform.
Yes, there we go. The big battle of the when Reform really broke away, in the I think it's called the Hamburg Platform. It was primarily around the prayer book. It was primarily around the language of the tefillah. I mean, the organ was its own issue. Second day Yantiv? Yeah, that was another thing. It's always this, always second day Yantiv. But they had an issue with davening in Hebrew, and you take a look at the Mishnah Brura. Look what he quotes from the Chasim Sofer in source number 8, Shuvas Chasim Sofer. If you want to see all of the halachic responsa about the reform and the issues with the reform, a lot of it is in Chasim Sofer. He was one of the earlier opponents of it. He writes there in Or Chaim Simin Pei Dalet or Pei Vav Sheherich Bekama Rayas that you should not daven in other languages. Mitzvah min hamuchar, the Mishnah says to daven in Lashon Kodesh. Demashi tiru l'sbal b'choloshin hainu davka b'akroi. Really, you should only do it once in a while. Avol l'kfoag b'kfias tamidis ula'amid shots to set it up this way that we're all going to daven in English or in other languages. It's going to come to what? A forgetting of l'hashchiach l'lashon hakodesh l'gamrei. People will forget Lashon Kodesh. And he says that's impossible. We cannot allow this. Many of the proofs and the supports for this from all of the rabbis of the time. Besifra Divrei Habris. I'm not familiar with the sefer. The eskimu she'iser gomerhu lasos kain. It's a formal iser, a formal prohibition. Ulafuke mikitos chadashos. To separate from these new groups. You see this, right? This is what Dovi just said. Ulishnispartzu michutz lemedina bezeh vehetiku eskol nusachat filo lashon ha'amim v'ha'avera goreres avera. You're gonna, they don't want to do Hebrew anymore. So it's Shulchan Aruch. It's not so crazy. But he says, go avera goreres avera. They're gonna do one thing, and what's the next? Mixed dancing. But that's not what he says here. But that's the famous joke. Shedalgu abracha shel kibbutz golios. They don't want to use language Lashon Kodesh. Then what's the next step? The next step is we have the new Jerusalem is Berlin, right? That's what one of the platforms was. and they don't want to go back to Eretz Yisrael. That was for then, but now we have the emancipation. We've reached our messianic era, and Birchas Yerushalayim, they take out any references to Yerushalayim, and they want to forget any zikron of Yerushalayim at all, and therefore it's a slippery slope. And they take away Lashon Kodesh, they take away any semblance of Hebrew, Jewish identity, any connection to the land, and that was all part of their the Reform's separation from the national identity, which had a lot to do with their approach, because they wanted a Jew to be a loyal citizen of the country. And by the way, this even went so far. They had a platform. I think it was in Columbus, Ohio, I believe. Or maybe it was Charleston, South Carolina. Sorry, they had a few different platforms in North Carolina. Early American reform, they reversed this decision in the early 1910s, I think. They reversed this decision and they decided we're going to, the reform movement's going to again reinstate that return to the land of Israel is a value. And there was this rabbi, his name was Elmer Berger, who was one of the first early anti-Zionists, and he was, we have to go back to the original, the reform, that we are not a independent national identity. We are just we're just American, or we're just whatever citizen we are. We don't. And he had close ties to a lot of anti-Zionists. Very fascinating. I read about this in Rabbi David Beshevkin has an article on Jewish history in the Parsha. So he talked about this. Very interesting.
There's a book called The First Rabbi. It's about before the Civil War. It was the first rabbi was sent over by the Chassam Sofer.
To where? To North America?
North America, to be in those days what would have been the chief rabbi, but it wasn't really such a thing. And it talks about how actually there were a lot of Orthodox rabbis who were in Shul who were traveling down to South Carolina. There wasn't social media back then. They would travel down to South Carolina secretly to do to learn about the Reform movement, and then come back to their Orthodox synagogues, and the congregants would get wind of it, and then rabbis would come back, and there would be fights. And
interesting.
All that would happen.
What's the book called? The First Rabbi?
I have it at home if you want it.
Cool. So that's how you know about the Charleston, North Carolina.
Sofer and South Carolina, and the rabbis who were trying to
South Carolina, right? Yeah. So it's a very old congregation there, 1700s. Yeah. So you see that there's this major hesitation. Oh, it's getting late. Okay, 10 more minutes. Major hesitation in the poskim to allow davening in there. It was German because of what the background was. Other reasons to daven in Hebrew. There's a Bir Halacha who quotes from a Sefer Hasidim that says there's these special segulos. More Chaim Magid, whatever. He's not here, but the Sephardim are very right. Sephardim have a lot of things right. They feel this whatever. They're just they're connected to tefillah in a special way, and they have this idea you feel it's more authentic. It's more, and the Sefer Hasidim, he says there are segulos rabos mikol lashonos. That there's more we'll call it maybe spiritual power in Lashon Kodesh than other languages. It's the language of Nevi'im. Hashem speaks to Nevi'im in Lashon Kodesh. It's the language which Hashem used to create the world. Obviously, we want to try to daven in that language. Another point that the poskim make is that some of the translations that we have are not so accurate. It's it's not always correct. We don't always know all the proper translations. Take a look at Mishnah Berurah, source number 10, Siman Samach Beis, Sifkat and Gimel. So he points this out. He says there's a lot of language that is very difficult to translate. Not only that we don't know it, but it's difficult. He says Vishinantam in Kriya Shema. So Chazal tell us it means to become sharpened. It means it's hard to really define it. Totafos beinenecha. You should have signs. That's not what does that mean? Tefillin, signs, which word do you use? It's not so easy to give translation to these things, and therefore it's a good idea to daven in Lashon Kodesh. And the Tshuva Me'ava, interesting, a Talmud of the Nodeb Yehuda, he says people travel a lot nowadays. This is a very practical thing, and if you daven, if everyone starts davening, this is like a halachic policy thing, which is interesting. If you think about halacha, there's a cut and dry halacha, shulchan aruch, and now we're talking policy a little bit, and there is such a concept a little bit that we look at sort of meta, what's the communal policy going to be? If the communal policy was everyone prays in their own language, if I go from Eastern Europe and I travel to I don't know, Greece or Rome or Italy or for business, or I go to India or all these places, I'm not going to even be able to go to a minyan. Right? The opposite is the case for, like, Daf Yomi is incredible because I can go from any place here and I could go sit in a shir somewhere else because we're all learning the same thing. But imagine if you would come into a shul, you're going away, you're going to a simcha in some country, and you go to shul and everyone's speaking a different language. You're like, what is this? Like, it would totally remove the sense of cohesive communal aspect. That's an interesting, again, this is halacha policy, because halachically, it seems to be totally fine, but the Achronim are saying it's not a good idea, it's spiritually not as powerful, there's issues with reform, and there's also this practical sense that, people are not going to feel connected or be able to daven in other places. There's a shayla that was asked, I was trying to figure this out last night, it was a shayla that was asked to Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, who was living in Montreux, I think that's how to pronounce it, in Switzerland, the end of his life after the war. Very, very fascinating. Probably one, I would say, the best. If you like this sort of stuff, the best biography I believe written, maybe one of the best, is Mark Shapiro's book on the Sridei Eish, Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. Dov, you read it before or no?
Which one?
Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. It's called Between Modern Orthodoxy and the Yeshiva World. It's really an incredible biography. So he talks about Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who was sort of this in-between figure between two worlds. But he was asked the following shayla, and I was trying to figure out who asked him the shayla. I think, maybe the Chaver could help me, I think that if you look at the shayla, it was asked by Harav Aleph, I think it's Elio Jung Shlita, Rav Av based in Bekihilas Ureim New York Rabasi. I think, I don't know, because it's a strange title, but I believe this was Rabbi Leo Jung, who was the rabbi of the Jewish Center in New York. I don't know why it's called Kehilas Ureim. I don't know why he's all called Av Basin, so maybe I'm wrong. But Rabbi Leo Jung, I believe, was a very, very prominent American rabbi who was the rabbi of the Jewish Center for many years, and he also just had a hand in many, many different community activities, and he was part of the Beis Yaakov movement. He helped Agudas Yisrael. He raised money for many yeshivas. He was really at the forefront of I could say, many, many initiatives, communal initiatives. So I believe this is Rabbi Leo Jung asking Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg this question. He asks him, can we set up reading piyutim, which are like extra tefillos, in English? Or so, and just generally, can we daven in English in our shuls? And this, remember, is in like the early, Taf Shin Yud Daled. Taf Shin Yud Daled. So it's in the early, right? It's in the early days of in the early 20th century in New York. And he's asking this question. And so he tells it on a technical level, it seems like it's not a problem. So mitzad adin, there's no isser, he writes. This is in source number 11, Sridei Eish Chelik Aleph Simin Ches. But then he gives him some good advice. He says, on a technical level, it's fine. As we mentioned, the Shulchan Aruch, he quotes Mishnah Berurah, fine. However, Ulam, Baruch li keshemesh, it is clear to me like the sun. Shacharedim yisnagdu lo. That he's talking about you, right, Rabbi Young. People are going to get really upset with you if you do this, right? The charedim are going to come. The frum are going to come. V'yitzu alav kol shehu min hamitaknim. People are going to say, you're one of the reformers. I think that's what the word means. Miknaktim. You're going to be one of the mitakin, right? The reformers, to the fixers. I think it means in a negative sense. V'yimtzu anashim balei, and what you're going to find that what they're going to the kanoim are going to get after you, right? Shimtzu makom lehisnaged hiskader v'yatzu laz v'rinon. They're going to try to, besmirch you and try to make you an example. I think that's what it means here. Anglit. That they're going to say, look at this guy, this reformer, he's setting up his shul to daven in English. What do you have to bother them? You're gonna upset them. You're gonna raise their ire of those who are tamimim, who are sensitive, who are, they feel they're going to become sick with any change in the minhag Yisrael. And he adds on a few things. So first of all, he's saying, it's not a good idea. Like people are people are gonna call you a reformer. They're gonna get on your case. It's just not a good idea.
Pure halacha, it sounds
Pure
like
halacha, it's fine. Pure halacha, it's fine. But he's telling him, it's okay. But some things are fine. They're not a problem. But it's just not wise to do. And that's he's saying in quotes from the Chasam Sofer again, like we mentioned about the kviyas to do it every established in a different language. And then he says, today lo nishar lanu makom liyadus shlemo tahora chutz mibeis hakneses. Today, all we have left is the tzura of a Beis HaKnesses. We don't have the Beis HaMikdash. We don't have. He says all we have is the sanctity of our Beis HaKnesses. Now you could say, well, what about the Jewish home? What about the yeshivas? But he's saying on a communal level, we have to be very sensitive to the fact that we need the image of a Beis HaKnesses. L'chach tzarich l'daktik shesham tieh lashon hakodesh hashareres hayichida. You have to be so careful to therefore keep it pristine, keep it in lashon kodesh. And he says, you know what? If you don't use other languages, it'll cause people to want to learn lashon kodesh. And therefore, if we prohibit using other languages, it will influence people to change. Getting to the time, so let me just summarize what we've seen so far. We didn't get up to some of the personal lishonos, but this is a general question when it comes to halacha. How much do we push people to aspire for more, to be pushed to do, or how much do we meet people where they're at? Right? There was once a time in which the yeshivas, the shuls, it was very rigid. Either you're in or you're out. It's just like sink or swim, buddy. Like, get with the program. And I think we moved away from that. I think we're moving more towards, help the children in school. The Rebbe's talking Yiddish. I don't understand. So either you could, whack them over the head, or you could say, we need to work with the kids, right? So I think we've moved in the direction of really differential education and skills and mental health and meeting people where they're at and becoming more community oriented and not just just textual learning. But I think there is a point that maybe
community you're talking about.
Depends which community, depends where. But I think overall, in the bigger spectrum, I think we've taken this approach. But there is a question of at what sacrifice? Have we lost the aspiration? Have we lost any semblance of we have to raise people to, right? Like announcing the page numbers. Like someone said to me, these are small things, but very large. It's a good question to ask, of the leadership of a shul or leadership of a community. These are important questions. Someone said to me, why are we announcing the page numbers? Like the people have been... Ask your person next to you, figure it out. And on the one hand, I hear that. On the other hand, it's like, well, meet them where they're at and make it comfortable, make it easier. So whenever you're dealing with this question, you can make things easier. I'm not saying it's lowering the level, but it's making it more accessible, but then you're not pushing people. So this is, you're not pushing them to move there. So this is a constant tension, and I think that's really what this is about today. It's not really about reform. I don't think we're battling reform clearly. I mean, unfortunately, it's very, very sad to see what's going on. But the battle is more, and this is like what Dovi was saying, depending on your community, depending on your orientation, the question, I don't want to say the battle, the question that has to be asked, and I'm just raising the question on a communal level, is how far do we want to reach out? And that causes us to, when we reach out, I guess a little bit to water it down because it needs to be palatable, like, to everybody, and how much do we want to select a few, create the core, and then everyone else has to move up and to aspire to higher. I don't have the answer to that question. There's not a simple answer, but that's the tension and that you see in this tshuva of this Ridei Eish, where he's saying, halachically, totally fine, but he feels we need to push people, and that's what his approach was, and it was a different world in the early 20th century in North America. We're living in a different time, in a different place, and I think that the question should be always reevaluated. And in terms of the practical question of davening in English, for sure, Baalei Tshuva, for sure, people who don't understand Hebrew, for sure, but there is a value to try as a community to keep certain things special, certain things sacred, and I think the reason why certain communities are so successful at this is they emphasize kriya and learning in Hebrew and there's a certain beauty to that traditionalism that there is a beauty to that, at the same time, it doesn't work for everybody. So you have to sort of make a balance. So as we always come out, it's a balance. It's a balance. You see different perspectives, and it's fascinating to see, again, this. I try to find the conceptual or the policy or the ideas underlying the sugya, and that's, I think, at the core of the contemporary halakhic question, is this bigger question of communal orientation to inclusivity versus, I don't want to say exclusivity, but elitism, maybe you could say. Okay, we'll hold it here.